she was 59. Menopause had come and gone years ago. So why was her drawer full of bloodied pads? That question hit me like a punch to the chest, and nothing, not the silence, not the smiles, not even her strength, could explain what I found buried in that old wooden drawer. This isn't just a story about illness, it's about secrets, guilt, and the day I realized that even the strongest women carry wounds no one sees. If you've ever kept something hidden too long, or know someone who has, this story might be for you. Hit subscribe to hear more stories like this, raw, real, and maybe just what someone out there needs to hear. It had been over a year since Sarah last stepped into the house where she was raised. Middletown, Ohio was already chilled by early November winds when she pulled up to the curb in front of her childhood home. The porch light flickered like an aging heartbeat. The garden was overrun by brittle weeds, and the silence that greeted her when she opened the front door felt more like absence than peace. The air inside was still, the smell hadn't changed, a mixture of furniture polish, faint lavender from the bathroom, and something older, dustier, like time left unchecked. Evelyn, her mother, hadn't come to the door. Sarah had texted her twice that morning, no reply, just the usual, "I'll leave the key in the blue dish." She found the key exactly where her mother said it would be. Entering felt like walking into a museum exhibit titled Mom's Life, 2023, everything in its usual place. The couch with the crocheted blanket over the armrest, the ceramic owl clock that hadn't told time since 2011, the muted TV playing some daytime talk show to no one. Sarah set her bag down quietly. "Mom?" she called, not loudly. It didn't feel like a place where loudness belonged anymore. She walked through the hallway, noticing dust where there didn't used to be. A stack of unopened mail on the console, a mug with lipstick on the rim, long since gone cold. Her mother was out, it seemed, likely her weekly trip to the farmer's market or her monthly appointment at the hair salon she refused to switch, even though the stylist now had shaky hands. Sarah went upstairs to the bedroom. She hadn't planned to snoop. She was looking for the family bank passbook, which Evelyn always insisted should be kept in the bottom drawer of the vanity dresser, because no thief ever checks with the tampons, she once joked. The drawer didn't glide open easily. It stuck a bit, the wood warped from age and weather. When she finally got it loose, the smell was the first thing to hit her. Not mold, not dust, metallic, sharp, something unmistakable. The contents were a strange mix. Old postcards, receipts from a 2003 pharmacy visit, a photograph of Sarah in high school, a dried-up rose wrapped in plastic, and nestled beneath a folded newspaper from last winter was a plastic package. She pulled it out gently. Maxi pads. One of them had been used and then folded neatly into the wrapper again, sealed with shaky hands, then wrapped again in tissue. Blood, dark red, bordering on black, thick. Sarah froze. Her mind did the math. Evelyn was 59. She'd gone through menopause nearly 10 years ago. There was no rational reason for menstrual bleeding now. Unless... She swallowed hard. Her breath slowed and shallowed. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the facts were staring back at her in the form of a soiled sanitary pad in her mother's drawer. 1,000 thoughts collided. She tried to be rational, maybe a cut, a nosebleed cleaned up with a pad, but the logic unraveled. That wasn't the kind of thing Evelyn would do, and why hide it? Why wrap it and tuck it into a drawer full of forgotten things? There was a sickening feeling in her gut. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't random. This was something her mother was dealing with, and hiding. Sarah sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. The drawer still hung open beside her. She stared at the pad in her hands, the neat fold, the tissue wrap. It was recent, she could tell, not from years ago, and it had been handled with the kind of care that screamed shame, fear. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. The sunlight from the window hit the edge of the drawer just right, casting a thin golden line across the wrapper. The image felt symbolic, too perfect, almost cinematic, light illuminating what someone had worked so hard to hide. The house was still silent. She stood and carefully placed the item back exactly where she found it, refolding the newspaper, closed the drawer. She didn't know why she did it. Habit, respect, denial. Downstairs, the front door creaked open. Footsteps. "Sarah?" It was her mother's voice, and Sarah's heart skipped, not from surprise but from uncertainty. She didn't know how to face her now, not yet. She took a long, steady breath and called out, "Hi, Mom. I'm here." But something had already shifted. The drawer had been opened, and with it, a part of their relationship, an unspoken boundary, had been crossed. The next morning, the house felt different. Not warmer, not exactly colder, just heavier, as if something invisible had settled in overnight. Sarah noticed it in the way her mother moved through the kitchen, slower than usual. Evelyn stirred her tea without looking up, her lips pursed tightly, the way she always did when her thoughts were elsewhere. They ate in near silence. Sarah tried to ignore the drawer, but the image kept coming back. The folded tissue, the dark stain, it clung to her mind like the bitter taste of black coffee she hadn't asked for. After breakfast, Evelyn disappeared into the laundry room. Sarah followed quietly a few minutes later. The door was cracked open. Steam curled from a pot of boiling water beside the washing machine. Evelyn was scrubbing something by hand. A pair of light beige cotton underwear. Sarah stepped back instinctively, her heart knocking against her chest. She hadn't meant to spy. But something in her mother's posture stopped her, bent low, shoulders tense, as if she were scrubbing away a secret, not a stain. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat at the dining room table, laptop open but untouched. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her thoughts trapped. She typed the words postmenopausal bleeding into the search bar. The results hit like punches. Can be an early sign of endometrial cancer, often ignored until it's too late. Most common in women over 50. She clicked on an article written by a gynecologist. It explained the importance of early detection, how a simple ultrasound or biopsy could save a life, how silence was the greatest risk. Sarah closed the laptop, suddenly nauseous. She remembered something from years ago, when she was 16 and had a scare of her own. Evelyn had been cold, clinical. "Don't act like a child," she'd said. "We don't panic until we know something." Sarah remembered thinking her mother was made of steel. But now, with blood in a drawer and silence in the air, that steel seemed rusted, brittle. Evelyn came in from the garden with damp knees and dirt under her nails. She didn't mention the laundry, didn't mention the bathroom light that had been on for an hour. She just said, "We're out of cinnamon," and added it to a shopping list. Sarah nodded but didn't write it down. That night, long after her mother went to bed, Sarah sat on the stairs in the dark, listening. The floor creaked once, then again, soft, deliberate steps. The bathroom light flicked on, 10 minutes passed. 20. She tiptoed to the hallway. The door was closed. She waited until it opened. Evelyn stepped out slowly, holding something wrapped in paper towels. Her expression was unreadable. She turned down the hallway toward the laundry room. The door clicked shut. Sarah stood there in the hallway, rooted. A chill spread through her bones. This wasn't just denial anymore. This was routine. She walked back to her room and lay on the bed, eyes open to the ceiling. Her mother was bleeding. Her mother was hiding it. And for the first time, Sarah felt something heavier than fear, helplessness. The following day, Sarah tried to act normal. She offered to make tea, asked about the neighbor's dog, the one that barked at everything. Evelyn answered politely but distantly, as if they were acquaintances, not mother and daughter. At the grocery store, Sarah watched her mother move slowly through the aisles. There was a slight limp she hadn't noticed before. When she reached for a jar on the top shelf, her hand trembled. Not much, but enough to make Sarah catch her breath. Back at home, Evelyn went upstairs with a heating pad, said it was just a little back pain. She shut her door. Sarah didn't follow. She sat on the couch and stared at the wall, thinking she needed help. Facts. Context. Something. She called Rachel, her old college roommate who now worked as a nurse practitioner in Chicago. "Rach," she whispered, sitting in the garage so Evelyn wouldn't hear. "Can I ask you something kind of serious?" Rachel listened patiently. Sarah described everything she'd seen. The pad, the laundry, the late-night trips to the bathroom, the secrecy. When she finished, Rachel's voice dropped to a level Sarah had only heard once before. When her father was dying, "This sounds serious," Rachel said. "Postmenopausal bleeding is never normal, not ever. It could be polyps, fibroids, maybe just hormone imbalance. But the risk of endometrial cancer? That's real, especially at her age." Sarah swallowed. "What should I do?" Rachel paused. "You have to get her to a doctor. Sooner rather than later." "She won't go," Sarah whispered. "She shuts down, pretends nothing's happening. Then you make her go. Be blunt. Be her daughter. And if that doesn't work, be her advocate." Sarah thanked her and ended the call. She sat for a long time in the garage, the scent of old paint and motor oil thick around her. That night, she found Evelyn on the porch, watching the dusk settle over the backyard. Her mother's hands were folded in her lap, unmoving. The light caught the silver in her hair. She looked small, fragile. Sarah almost said it then, almost blurted out everything. But the words caught. Something in her mother's stillness made her hesitate. Instead, she sat beside her. For a while, they didn't speak. The air was filled with the sound of crickets, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barking at the coming dark. It wasn't time yet, but soon. She would say it soon. The moment came quietly, not with shouting or some dramatic confrontation. It began on a gray Wednesday morning, over a sink full of dishes in a silence that had lasted one day too long. Sarah stood at the window drying a mug. Outside, the trees swayed in slow, windless rhythm, their bare limbs like raised hands searching for something to hold. Behind her, Evelyn scrubbed a pan that didn't need scrubbing. Her knuckles were white, skin wrinkled from the water. Sarah turned slowly, the words rising before she could stop them. "You're bleeding, aren't you?" The sentence hung in the air, sharp and invasive. Evelyn didn't respond right away. She just kept her eyes fixed on the soapy water. "I found the pad," Sarah added, her voice softer now, "in your drawer. Still nothing. You're not just hiding it," she said. "You're avoiding it, and I don't understand why." Finally, Evelyn looked up. Her eyes, once vibrant and piercing, now held something distant, something cold. Not anger, not even fear, just detachment. "What I do with my body is none of your concern," she said, each word clipped, polished, clean. Sarah's fingers tightened around the mug. "You could be sick. I've been through worse." "That's not the point," Sarah said, more forcefully. "You're almost 60. Bleeding after menopause isn't normal. It's not just some inconvenience to ignore." "I didn't ask for a medical lecture." Evelyn rinsed the pan and set it aside. "And I certainly didn't ask you to go through my things." Sarah stepped closer, heart pounding. "I didn't mean to snoop. I was looking for the passbook. I wasn't expecting to find—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The image was still too fresh. Evelyn dried her hands slowly, folding the towel like she was performing a sacred ritual. Then she looked at her daughter with an expression Sarah hadn't seen since she was a teenager caught sneaking out. A mix of disappointment and something deeper, unspoken. "There are things you don't understand," Evelyn said. "Then help me understand," Sarah replied. But Evelyn walked past her, the soft thud of her footsteps down the hallway echoing like small doors closing behind each step. Sarah stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the quiet sink, the sunlight catching streaks on the window glass. She felt an ache settle into her chest, an ache that came not just from fear, but from knowing that she had hit something immovable. She had crossed a line, and her mother had built another. That night, Sarah sat in the guest bedroom with the lights off. The glow from her laptop cast a faint silver onto the ceiling. She read article after article, some clinical, some compassionate, all pointing to the same truth. What her mother was experiencing was not normal and not safe. She thought about what it meant to be a daughter, to care enough to push, to love enough to risk being hated. In the morning, Evelyn was already dressed, standing by the stove, frying eggs. She acted as if nothing had happened, as if yesterday's words were just static in the background of their lives. Sarah didn't play along. She sat at the table and said, "If you were anyone else, I'd have already called an ambulance." Evelyn didn't turn. "But I'm not anyone else." "No, you're not," Sarah said. "You're my mother, which means I have to live with the consequences if something happens to you." Evelyn placed the plate of eggs in front of her. "Eat while it's warm." The silence returned like a curtain being drawn. Sarah didn't eat. Later, as they worked in the garden, Evelyn tugging at stubborn weeds, Sarah pretending to rake, the conversation resumed, this time in short, sharp bursts between the rustling of dry leaves. "I watched Dad die slow," Sarah said. "And it destroyed you." Evelyn's hand froze on a root. She didn't look up. "I don't want to watch that happen again, especially not when it's preventable." Evelyn finally stood, brushing dirt from her knees. Her face was flushed, but not from the sun. "You think I'm afraid of death?" "No," Sarah said. "I think you're afraid of hearing the word that starts it." There was a long pause. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, as if assessing her opponent. Then she spoke, quiet but firm. "Sometimes, not knowing is the only peace we get." Sarah took a breath, steadying herself. "And sometimes not knowing kills us faster." Evelyn shook her head and turned away. "You always did think you were the brave one." "I learned it from you," Sarah said, but her mother had already walked away. That night, the house was still again. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the corner of an old blanket. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing through every memory of her mother, strong, controlled, proud. But pride could become a prison, and Sarah wasn't ready to watch it turn into a grave. There were nights when the house spoke louder than its occupants. The floor creaked in rhythms too familiar to be noticed anymore. The heater wheezed like an old man clearing his throat, and the walls, thick with history, absorbed secrets in silence. Sarah lay awake in the dark, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan. She could hear her mother's footsteps, soft, slow, from the bedroom down the hall. The bathroom door clicked shut again. Water ran briefly, then stopped. Another night, another routine. She couldn't sleep. Not just because of the sounds, but because of the memories they stirred. She remembered the summer she turned 12, the first time her father collapsed. He had been in the garden, holding a hose in one hand and a half-trimmed rose bush in the other. One moment he was there, tall and steady, the next he was crumpled on the ground, groaning. It turned out to be the first sign of something worse. The doctors had called it late-stage colon cancer. Sarah hadn't understood much back then. All she remembered was the shift in her mother's eyes, the tightening, the armor sliding into place. Evelyn had refused to cry. Not once. She managed medications, schedules, hospital visits, even hospice, with the efficiency of a war general. Sarah admired her for it, resented her for it, hoped, somewhere deep down, that if anything ever happened to her, her mother would fall apart just a little, just enough to feel real. But Evelyn never did. Even at the funeral, she'd stood like stone, accepted condolences with a tight smile. And then, 2 days later, she returned to work at the library as if life hadn't just carved out half her soul. Now, over a decade later, Sarah wondered, had her mother truly moved on, or just buried the grief so deep it started bleeding out through her body? She thought about genetics, about bloodlines, disease. She had read somewhere that trauma, when left unspoken, doesn't disappear. It settles into bone, becomes a language the body learns to speak when words fail. Was that what this was? Sarah didn't want to ask herself the real question, the one that twisted under every thought she had since finding the blood in that drawer. What if this ends the same way? She got up and padded quietly down the stairs to the kitchen. She didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she stood near the counter and stared out the window into the backyard. The garden was faint in the moonlight, overgrown and half dead. So much had withered while no one was watching. When morning came, she brewed coffee, not out of habit, but out of a need to feel in control of something. The bitter scent grounded her. Evelyn entered the kitchen 20 minutes later, already dressed, hair pulled back neatly as always. She looked tired, more than tired. There were shadows under her eyes, the kind makeup couldn't hide. Her skin had taken on a paler hue, and yet she moved as if nothing were wrong. Sarah studied her closely. Every movement was a performance, every smile carefully shaped. The fear that lived in Sarah's chest wasn't just for her mother's health. It was for the silence that had become hereditary. Sarah remembered another moment, years ago, when she had experienced a health scare of her own, a strange lump under her arm, a lingering fatigue. She'd told her mother, expecting comfort. Instead, Evelyn had shrugged and said, "Let's not jump to conclusions." That was her mother's way. Always delay the panic. Always postpone the truth. But what if that delay was fatal? Later that day, Sarah found herself scrolling through an old email thread from her father, his final months. Notes he had written her, some silly, some profound. One stood out. The hardest part about dying isn't the pain, it's knowing someone else has to survive it. Sarah closed her eyes and held the words against her chest. She didn't want to survive her mother. Not like this. She wanted to stop it before it reached that point. But how do you fight against someone's willful blindness? She decided she needed a different weapon, something gentler than confrontation, but heavier than silence. She began to write, not a letter exactly, not a speech, just a reflection, a collection of truths, about how much her mother had meant to her, about the strength she'd admired, about the times she'd failed to say thank you, about how scared she was now, not of cancer, but of absence, of a future in which her mother's chair would be empty, her voice an echo, her memory a garden untended. She didn't know if she would ever share what she wrote. Maybe just the act of writing would be enough. Maybe, like her mother, she just needed to bleed the truth somewhere, quietly, without fanfare. When she finished, she folded the pages and slipped them into her journal. That night, Evelyn found her on the porch, staring at the stars. "You always did like the night," her mother said. Sarah nodded. "It's honest." They didn't say anything more. But for the first time in days, they sat side by side in something resembling peace. Sarah wasn't sure what pushed her to write the letter. Maybe it was the weight of too many unsaid things. Maybe it was the realization that pleading, persuading, even arguing had all failed. Or maybe she just needed to remind herself of why this mattered so deeply. She started at dawn, sitting in the corner of her old bedroom, where the wallpaper still bore faint outlines of posters long gone. The house was silent, save for the occasional groan of floorboards settling. Her pen moved slowly at first, as if dragging each word out from a place she'd avoided for years. She didn't write like a daughter trying to win an argument. She wrote like a woman trying to hold on to something that was slipping through her fingers. "Dear Mom," she began, "I don't know how to say this out loud without you building another wall, so I'm writing, hoping the silence between my words will speak louder than my voice ever could." She told Evelyn about the little things, how she still folded towels the way her mother taught her, how she kept the first teacup Evelyn gave her in a box, even though it had cracked years ago, how she remembered vividly the exact moment when she realized her mother was stronger than most people ever dared to be. She wrote about her father, too, about watching Evelyn carry the house on her back during his illness, the way she smiled at neighbors while secretly rationing groceries, the way she helped him to the bathroom and back, pretending it wasn't painful, pretending she wasn't tired, how at the funeral Sarah had wished her mother would cry, just once, so she could crawl into that grief with her. But mostly she wrote about fear. Not her mother's fear, her own. "I'm scared," she wrote, "not of cancer, not even of death, but of being left behind again, of knowing you were in pain and didn't let me in, of hearing the phone ring one morning and realizing I've run out of chances to say the things I never said." The letter ran long, 3 pages, then 4. At the end, she didn't sign it with love or anger. Just a simple line, "Whatever it is, Mom, I'd rather face it with you than be left alone to wonder." She folded the pages and placed them inside an envelope, hesitating as her fingers hovered over the flap. She considered leaving it on her mother's pillow, on the kitchen table, inside her purse, but instead, she tucked it between the pages of her journal and set it aside. Later that afternoon, Evelyn was out in the yard pulling the last of the wilted marigolds. The sky had darkened, clouds sagging with the weight of early snow. Sarah stood by the window, the letter hidden in her pocket, watching the woman who had built her world, and then her phone buzzed. A message from Evelyn. "Can you come home next weekend? I need you to take me somewhere." Sarah stared at the screen, heart racing, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. There was no explanation, no apology, no reference to their recent tension. But there was something else. "A crack in the armor?" Sarah replied immediately, of course. "Anything." When the weekend arrived, the drive back felt different, lighter, not because the air had changed or the roads were less winding, but because she wasn't entering a battlefield this time. She was answering a call. The sky was overcast when she arrived. The smell of burnt leaves lingered in the crisp air. Evelyn opened the door before Sarah had even knocked, as if she'd been waiting. She didn't smile, but she stepped aside to let her in, and that was enough. The next morning they ate in silence, but it wasn't the old silence, the one filled with tension and unsaid accusations. It was something gentler, like 2 people sharing a quiet before a storm. Evelyn wore a wool coat Sarah hadn't seen in years. She adjusted her scarf with trembling fingers. "Let's go," she said simply, and handed Sarah a slip of paper with an address. It was a clinic. Small, tucked behind a row of oak trees, discreet, clean. Sarah didn't ask why she chose this place. She didn't ask why now. She simply parked the car and followed her mother inside. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and citrus. A heater rattled softly near the floor. A woman at the front desk looked up with kind eyes and offered a clipboard. Evelyn took it without a word and sat down. Sarah sat beside her. For a moment, neither moved. Then Evelyn reached out slowly and took Sarah's hand. She didn't squeeze it, didn't say a word, just held it. Sarah looked at their joined hands, her mother's skin thinner now, veined like paper, but still warm, still solid, still here. They waited in silence until a nurse called Evelyn's name. She rose, but before walking through the door, she turned to Sarah. Her voice was soft but steady. "I'm only doing this because you stayed." Sarah nodded, throat tight. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. When the door closed behind her mother, Sarah remained in the chair, holding that warmth in her palm as if it could anchor her to this moment, this fragile, beautiful moment of surrender. The examination room was colder than Sarah expected, not cold like winter, cold like metal, like waiting. The kind of cold that settled into your bones and reminded you of everything sterile, unforgiving, and real. Evelyn sat on the edge of the padded table, legs dangling, fingers intertwined in her lap. She hadn't spoken since the nurse closed the door behind them. Her coat hung on a wall hook, scarf draped carefully over it. Her shoes, slightly worn at the toes, rested quietly on the floor below her feet. She looked smaller without them, like someone who'd shed more than just outerwear. Sarah sat in the chair across from her, hands folded tightly in her lap. She tried to appear calm, to mirror the stillness her mother had perfected over the years, but her knees bounced involuntarily, and her mouth was dry. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful, it was suspended, as if something heavy had been hung between them, waiting to fall. A clock on the wall ticked. She stared at the second hand moving in stiff little jumps, trying to match her breath to its rhythm. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale. The doctor entered with a quiet knock and a soft voice. Her name was Dr. Parker, early 40s, composed, gentle. She greeted Evelyn with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years walking women through the unknown. Sarah immediately liked her. Evelyn nodded, responding with polite brevity. She didn't ask questions. She didn't volunteer information. She simply followed directions. Dr. Parker read her file, reviewed the intake forms, then began the exam. Sarah stood and turned away when asked, giving her mother privacy, but she could still hear everything. The sound of gloves snapping into place, the paper lining the table crinkling beneath Evelyn's shifting weight, the pause before the doctor said, "We'll need to run a few more tests." That pause lingered. After a few minutes, Dr. Parker explained the next steps, an ultrasound, followed by an endometrial biopsy. Evelyn nodded, eyes unreadable. Her face remained composed as if she were being told the weather forecast. But when the doctor stepped out to arrange the scheduling, Evelyn exhaled, sharply, as though she'd been holding her breath the entire time. Sarah looked at her mother, seeing her not as the formidable woman who had survived widowhood and raised a child alone, but as someone fragile, not weak, but breakable. On the ride home, the silence continued, but this time it wasn't laced with avoidance. It was a quiet born of fatigue. Evelyn leaned against the window, head tilted, watching the world slide past. Her reflection in the glass was pale and thin. She didn't speak until they turned into their street. "You don't have to stay," she said softly. Sarah kept her eyes on the road. "I want to." Her mother didn't respond, but she didn't object either. That night, Evelyn went to bed early. Sarah stayed downstairs, curled up on the couch with an old throw blanket, reading through every medical article she could find on endometrial biopsies. She tried to find comfort in the statistics, in the words "most cases are benign," in survival rates and treatment options. But numbers don't comfort the way stories do, and the only story playing in her head was one she didn't want to relive, the final weeks of her father's life. She remembered the way he had changed, the weight loss, the grayness in his skin, the quiet resignation in his voice, the way Evelyn had held it all together for everyone except herself. It was only years later, in hindsight, that Sarah realized how much of that strength was performance, how much pain had been buried beneath the surface like rot under paint. She wondered now if her mother's refusal to face this had less to do with fear of death and more to do with the unbearable weight of having to be strong again, of carrying the possibility of bad news alone, of surviving something once more without anyone to lean on. In the days that followed, the tests were completed. The ultrasound showed a thickened endometrial lining. The biopsy was sent to the lab. And then came the waiting. Those were the hardest days. Days filled with teacups left half drunk, books picked up and put down, endless loops of meaningless television. Evelyn cooked when she didn't need to, cleaned what was already clean, folded laundry that wasn't hers. Sarah tried not to hover. She let her mother have her silence, but stayed within reach. Like gravity, unseen but constant, one afternoon they were folding sheets together when Evelyn spoke almost in a whisper. "I thought if I ignored it, it would go away." Sarah didn't answer. She waited. It started months ago. Just spotting, here and there. I convinced myself it was nothing. A blip, but it kept happening. I started counting how many pads I had left, thinking, when they run out, I'll stop. She paused, her hands stilled on the fabric. But they never ran out. I just kept buying more. Sarah swallowed hard. The weight of her mother's confession settled into the space between them like a third presence. I didn't want to know, Evelyn continued. I saw what knowing did to your father. Sarah nodded slowly. And not knowing? Evelyn looked at her, eyes brimming, not with tears but with something heavier. Regret, weariness. It made me invisible to myself. Later that night, Sarah stood by the kitchen sink, washing a single glass under warm water. Outside, the wind stirred the dry leaves on the porch. Upstairs, she could hear her mother brushing her teeth. She glanced at the drawer, the same drawer she had opened weeks ago. It remained closed now, but she no longer feared what was inside, because whatever it had been, it was no longer a secret. The call came on a Friday afternoon. Sarah had just returned from a walk, her shoes dusted with brittle leaves, the kind that crunch underfoot without apology. The clinic number flashed across her phone screen, and for a moment everything else fell away. The breeze, the sky, even her own breath. The results were in. Dr. Parker's voice was calm but clear. The biopsy revealed a condition called simple endometrial hyperplasia without atypia. Non-cancerous, but still a warning. A red flag, if not yet a fire. We caught it early, the doctor said. With treatment and monitoring, she'll be okay. Sarah thanked her and hung up. Relief swept through her, sharp and sudden, almost painful in its intensity. But it didn't bring tears. Not yet. It only brought stillness. Evelyn was in the backyard, pulling weeds with her bare hands. She looked up as Sarah approached, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. Her face didn't ask the question. It already knew the answer. It's not cancer, Sarah said softly. Evelyn nodded, as if she'd heard the diagnosis in her dreams before it was spoken aloud. She returned to the earth between her fingers, her movements slower, more deliberate. They didn't celebrate. There was no outburst of joy, only the quiet understanding of a disaster narrowly avoided, of a shadow that had loomed but never landed. That night, Sarah found Evelyn in the living room, staring at an old photograph on the mantel. It was of her and her late husband, Sarah's father, taken sometime in the early 1980s. They were younger, laughing, wind in their hair, a version of themselves Sarah had never known. I used to be someone else, Evelyn said without turning, before all of this. Sarah didn't interrupt. I had secrets before you were born, she continued. I thought I buried them deep enough, but some things don't stay buried. They come back in strange ways. Sarah felt the tension rise in her chest. She sensed that what was about to be said would change everything, not just her understanding of her mother, but perhaps of herself. Evelyn sat down slowly on the edge of the couch. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. I was 19, she began, in college, newly married. Your father had just started his job at the bank. We were broke. I found out I was pregnant. Sarah sat across from her, silent. We weren't ready. At least he wasn't. He panicked, said we'd lose everything, that a baby would ruin our chances. He begged me, pleaded. She paused. So I agreed. Sarah's breath caught. I had the abortion at a clinic 3 towns over. Alone. He couldn't bear to come. Evelyn's voice didn't shake. It was almost too steady, too rehearsed. There were complications, she continued. I got an infection. Spent 3 days in the hospital with a fever. They said I might never carry again. She looked up finally, her eyes meeting Sarah's. You weren't supposed to happen. You were the miracle. The silence in the room deepened, thickened. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't think past the thudding of her heart. I never told your father, Evelyn said. Not even when we found out I was pregnant with you. I carried that alone. She reached into a drawer beside the couch and pulled out a small faded envelope. Inside was a sonogram image, grainy, blurred, labeled only with a date from decades ago. Sarah stared at it, then at her mother, unable to speak. I didn't want to go to the doctor this time, Evelyn said, her voice quieter now, because I thought maybe this was my punishment. Sarah sat still for a long time, her thoughts spiraling, tangling. The revelation wasn't just shocking, it was seismic, a rearranging of the foundation she'd always stood on. She had grown up with the myth of her mother's strength, her certainty. Now, that myth was cracking open to reveal a woman who had once been scared, pressured, and alone. More than anything, Sarah felt displaced, as if her own story had shifted, tilted under this new gravity. So I'm not your first child, she said quietly. Not accusatory, not even angry, just trying to understand her place in the new story. No, Evelyn said, looking down at her hands, But you're the one I carried with intention, the one I kept. Sarah felt a strange ache rise in her throat. That sentence, intended as comfort, landed like a stone. She knew it was meant to express love, but it also underscored the absence of what had come before. A ghost sibling she had never met, never even imagined, now lived somewhere in the margins of her family's past. They sat in silence, the air thick with everything unspoken. Sarah stood finally, pacing slowly across the living room. She ran her fingers along the spines of old books, the edges of photo frames. Everything in this house had been carefully arranged, perfectly preserved, except the truth. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't have to say anything, Evelyn replied, but Sarah did. Why now? Why tell me this now? Evelyn looked up, her eyes softer than Sarah had ever seen them. Because I didn't want to die with it, and because I didn't want you to keep thinking I was fearless. I wasn't, I'm not. Sarah turned toward her slowly. I'm not angry, she said, and realized it was true. Just trying to find the edges of this. Evelyn gave a faint smile. There are no clean edges, not with things like this. Later that night, after Evelyn had gone to bed, Sarah stayed in the living room alone. She held the sonogram in her hand, staring at the blurry shape of a life never lived. She didn't know what to feel, grief, guilt, empathy, or some impossible combination of all three. She thought about the years her mother had spent carrying that secret, through raising a child, through losing a husband, through every holiday, every birthday, every quiet Sunday afternoon. That kind of silence wasn't emptiness, it was weight, and Evelyn had borne it alone. Sarah opened her journal and began to write, not in judgment, not in analysis, but in reverence. For the strength it must have taken to finally speak, for the courage to tell a daughter the worst part of your story, and hope it didn't shatter everything. As the night deepened, Sarah lit a candle and placed the sonogram beside it, not as a memorial, but as an offering, a gesture of acknowledgement, of peace. She whispered, I didn't know you existed, but now I do. Then she blew out the flame. The next morning, the house was too quiet. It wasn't the ordinary silence of a slow weekend or a morning after emotional exhaustion. It was the kind of silence that presses against the skin, that rings in the ears like something left unsaid or undone. Sarah noticed it as soon as she opened her eyes. The usual creaks of footsteps, the clinking of dishes from the kitchen, absent. The smell of coffee, missing. She walked through the house with careful steps. The bedroom door was open, the bed made, the bathroom empty, the back door slightly ajar. She called her mother's name once, twice. No answer. At first she didn't panic. Maybe Evelyn had gone for a walk, or to the store. Or maybe she just needed space after what she had shared the night before. But then Sarah saw the coat still hanging on the hook, the shoes still by the door, and the keys still in the bowl. Her pulse quickened. She checked the garden. Nothing. The garage, empty. The neighbor hadn't seen her. The streets nearby were quiet, no sign of movement. The minutes stretched, warped. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. Each tick of the clock deepened the ache in Sarah's chest. She remembered too clearly the weeks before her father's death, how he'd once gone missing for half a day, disoriented, walking aimlessly down their old street, trying to find the version of their house that existed only in his memory. Back then, Evelyn had gone after him, searching like a woman possessed, her voice echoing through the neighborhood as she called his name. Now Sarah heard only her own. She grabbed her phone and dialed. Evelyn didn't pick up. Her phone buzzed faintly from the kitchen counter. Sarah's mind raced. Had she gone to the clinic alone, the hospital, a walk that turned wrong, or something worse, something final? The idea hit her like cold water. Not cancer, not illness, but grief. Grief that finally found its shape and perhaps its escape. She drove aimlessly at first, scanning sidewalks, benches, park trails, called the library, the pharmacy, nothing. Then, without fully deciding, she turned down an old street, the one near the cemetery. Her father's grave was there. They hadn't visited together in years. When she arrived, the lot was mostly empty. The wind stirred dry leaves across the gravel. She walked through the gate, following a path her feet still remembered, past the small hill, past the row of pine trees, toward the quiet corner where her father rested. And there she was. Evelyn stood alone, coatless, hands tucked into her sleeves. Her back was to Sarah. She didn't move as her daughter approached. Only when Sarah stepped beside her did she speak, voice quiet, almost a whisper. I didn't know where else to go. Sarah didn't answer. She looked down at the gravestone, simple, clean, her father's name etched clearly, the dates firm in stone, and next to it the space Evelyn had chosen years ago, a future already prepared. I used to come here in the early days, Evelyn said. After he passed, I never told you. Sarah looked at her mother. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but dry. I talked to him like he was still listening, she continued. Told him about your report cards, the time you won that science fair, the day you left for college, all the things I never said while he was alive. She exhaled, long and quiet. I thought maybe, if I came here today, he'd still listen. Sarah swallowed. What did you say? Evelyn finally turned toward her. That I told you about everything, about before you, and that you didn't run. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the branches above them. The sky was thick with low gray clouds. I didn't come here to disappear, Evelyn added. I came to say goodbye to the version of myself that kept everything locked away. Sarah stepped closer, unsure whether to speak or simply stand beside her. She chose the latter. For a while they just looked at the stone, the name, the years, the life that had once shaped their own. Eventually, Evelyn broke the silence. You thought I left, didn't you? I didn't know, Sarah admitted. Evelyn nodded, her face unreadable. Then she said, I don't want to be afraid anymore. Sarah took her mother's hand. Then we won't be, she said. And in that small, wind-blown corner of the cemetery, with dead leaves curling around their feet, they stood together, not as parent and child burdened by history, but as two women learning at last how to grieve without guilt. The days that followed moved slowly, but not in a painful way. It was the kind of slowness that came after a storm, the kind where everything is quieter, softer, the air somehow cleaner. The fear had not vanished, but it had lost its sharpness. Now, it lived like a shadow, present but no longer in control. Evelyn began treatment the following week. Hormone therapy, regular monitoring. Dr. Parker laid out a clear plan, firm but reassuring. We'll keep an eye on it, she said. No panic, just care. Sarah sat beside her mother during those appointments, a quiet companion in the sterile rooms. Sometimes Evelyn would glance sideways and smile, not wide, but enough. Enough to say, thank you for not letting me face this alone. Back home, routines shifted. Evelyn no longer waited until midnight to wash clothes, no longer wrapped used pads like secrets. She talked cautiously at first about symptoms, about the pain, the fatigue, the shame, and then, slowly, about the past, about things Sarah had never known. In return, Sarah offered pieces of herself, small confessions, memories she had tucked away, how she used to listen at her parents' door as a child, just to make sure her mother was still breathing after her father died, how she used to wake at night, heart pounding, afraid that one day Evelyn would disappear too. They shared tea in the evenings, sometimes in silence, sometimes through stories. Real ones, not the sanitized versions meant for comfort, but the raw ones, the ones with jagged edges. One afternoon, Evelyn handed Sarah a notebook, spiral-bound, faded cover. I started this a month after your father died, she said. Didn't write much, just pieces. Sarah took it gently, flipping through pages filled with slanted handwriting. Entries dated with no titles, lines that read like fragments of thought, some almost too painful to read. Grief tastes like metal. It sits under my tongue all day. I screamed into a pillow last night, but it didn't help. She asked me today if I was okay. I lied, because the truth would break her. Sarah closed the notebook and looked at her mother. You never wanted me to know how hard it was, she said. Evelyn nodded. I thought protecting you meant hiding my cracks. Sarah reached across the table and took her hand. But I'm not afraid of them anymore, she said. I just don't want to pretend they're not there. That night, Sarah created a blog. She wasn't sure why. Maybe as a journal, maybe as a space for others who carried similar stories. She called it the Hidden Drawer. Her first post wasn't dramatic, just a quiet piece about what it means to find out your mother isn't invincible, about how strength sometimes looks like silence, but healing sounds like speaking. Within a week, comments began to appear. Women in their 50s, 60s, even 70s wrote messages that were both heartbreaking and familiar. Thank you for putting words to what I've never said aloud. I thought I was the only one too ashamed to go to the doctor. Your story made me book an appointment. Maybe it's not too late for me either. Sarah showed the messages to Evelyn, expecting discomfort. Instead, Evelyn read them slowly, nodding, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Not for Sarah's sake, but for her own. I didn't think anyone would understand, she said. "You're not alone," Sarah replied. "You never were. You just didn't know where to look." On Sundays, they started going for walks, short ones, just around the neighborhood at first. Evelyn wore a hat Sarah had bought for her years ago, unused until now. They greeted neighbors. They laughed at how out of shape they both were. But the rhythm of walking became their new prayer, a moving meditation of steps shared and stories exchanged. Evelyn began attending a small women's circle at the local church, not for religion, but for connection. Sarah drove her there the first time, waited outside unsure if her mother would stay, or she did. And when she came out an hour later, her face looked lighter, not young, not unburdened, but more open. "I told them," she said, buckling her seatbelt. Sarah glanced at her. "Told them what?" "About the bleeding, about being afraid." She hesitated. "About the other thing, too." Sarah didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Weeks passed, then months. The seasons began to shift again. Buds on trees, softer winds, lighter evenings. The fear never fully left. But it changed shape. Became something manageable. Something that walked beside them instead of against them. Evelyn still went to her appointments. She followed the treatments. She kept her notebook, still wrote on occasion. But now, the pages looked different. "Today I bought flowers for no reason. She made me laugh with a joke I didn't understand. I think I'm going to be okay. Not perfect, but okay." Sarah framed one of those entries and hung it by the front door. It read, "I told the truth, and I didn't die." Spring came almost unnoticed. Not in a dramatic way, not with cherry blossoms or sudden warmth, but in the quiet loosening of winter's grip. The snow melted without ceremony. The soil, once frozen solid, began to soften. Crocuses pushed through the earth like cautious messengers. Inside the house, change took a similar shape. Sarah was reorganizing the bedroom closet when she found herself standing in front of the vanity again. The drawer, the one she had opened months ago, that had changed everything. For a moment, she simply looked at it, uncertain whether she should touch it again, as if it still held a kind of reverence or danger. She pulled it open slowly. There was nothing shocking inside now. No stained tissue, no folded plastic, just the usual. Old receipts, a watch that no longer ticked, a pair of reading glasses Evelyn never used, and one item resting neatly in the back, a single unused sanitary pad in its wrapper. New, clean, untouched. Sarah stared at it for a moment, not with fear, not with sadness, but with understanding. It didn't feel like a secret anymore. She left the drawer open as she continued sorting, clothes that no longer fit, books her mother never finished, trinkets with stories long forgotten. The air in the room felt lighter, not empty, but aired out, as if years of silence had finally exhaled. Later that day, she found Evelyn in the backyard, kneeling by the edge of the garden, the soil between her fingers, fingernails rimmed with earth. A row of new plants lined the edge: basil, thyme, rosemary. Tiny things, fragile things, growing. "I'm thinking about repainting the vanity," Evelyn said casually as Sarah joined her. "That drawer's been sticky for years." Sarah smiled. "You're not planning to fill it with secrets again, are you?" Evelyn laughed. "Short but real, no. Just socks, maybe." They spent the afternoon cleaning the garage, a long postponed task that somehow felt appropriate. Boxes were opened, old furniture was rearranged. Evelyn handed Sarah a small crate marked with fading pen strokes. Sarah, kindergarten. Inside were drawings, photos, a faded paper crown. At the bottom, folded neatly, was a note, written in Evelyn's hand years ago. "You are the piece of me I never knew I needed. Even on days I didn't feel like a mother, you made me one." Sarah didn't say anything. She just folded the note back and held it to her chest. That evening, she stood once more in the bedroom, staring at the open drawer. And this time she emptied it. Gently, she removed everything, wiped down the inside, and lined it with fresh paper. No ceremony, no ritual, just the quiet act of making space. Later, Evelyn walked in and found her there. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Sarah replied, "but it felt right." Evelyn stepped closer, peered into the now empty drawer, then took something from her pocket. It was a key, for the garden shed, she said, placing it inside. "I keep forgetting where I leave it," Sarah smiled. A drawer, a key, no blood, no shame, just a place for something ordinary. When she went downstairs that night, the windows were open. A breeze moved through the house, soft and slow. For the first time in a long time, the air inside matched the air outside. Later, before bed, Sarah took one last look at the drawer, still open, still empty, still honest. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves, no crescendo, no spotlight, just a gentle shift, a drawer no longer stuck, a coat no longer hanging where it used to, a breath taken a little deeper than the one before it. Sarah didn't know when it happened. Exactly. Maybe it was the afternoon her mother handed her the garden key. Or maybe it was the first time she heard Evelyn laugh, really laugh, while trimming the rosemary. It could have been the day Evelyn showed her how to make the lemon bars her father used to love, and the sugar dusting the counter didn't feel like a mess, but a memory. Or maybe it was none of those moments. Maybe it was simply the quiet that came afterward, the kind of quiet that no longer hinted at secrets, but at peace. Months passed. The drawer stayed open. The blog continued. Sarah received dozens, then hundreds of messages from strangers, women who had watched mothers shrink into silence, daughters who had grown up believing pain should be hidden, husbands, sons, nurses, survivors, all writing the same thing in different ways. Thank you for reminding me I'm not alone. One woman from Nebraska wrote that she finally made an appointment after ignoring her symptoms for years. Another from Maine said she sat down with her adult daughter and told her the truth about the miscarriage she'd hidden for 3 decades. Sometimes healing begins not with medicine but with permission. Sarah never imagined her mother would become part of something bigger, but Evelyn had. Quietly, she had clipped each message Sarah printed and pinned them to a corkboard in the hallway, a growing mosaic of stories. Proof that silence, once broken, could echo into someone else's salvation. On the first day of fall, Sarah and Evelyn returned to the cemetery. No words this time, just a small bouquet of wildflowers. Evelyn placed them by her husband's grave, then stood beside her daughter, hands in her coat pockets. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. As they turned to leave, Evelyn paused. She looked out across the field, eyes distant. "You think he'd be proud?" she asked. Sarah didn't hesitate. "I think he already is." They drove home with the windows cracked, the scent of leaves and early dusk filling the car. That night, Sarah recorded a podcast episode, their story. Not in full detail, not all the cracks and corners, just enough to let someone, somewhere feel seen. She ended the episode with a question, the kind of question that doesn't ask for answers, only reflection. If you opened a drawer in your life today, what would be inside? Something hidden? Something that needs to be spoken? Something waiting to be let go? She paused, then said, "If it's fear, you don't have to carry it alone." The next morning, Sarah found a small note taped to her bedroom door. Her mother's handwriting. "I read every comment on the board. I think I finally believe them. You were right to open the drawer. No signature, just truth. The kind that no longer needed wrapping." Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the illness itself. It's the silence that comes with it. The drawer that stays closed. The words we never say. And the love we forget to show until it's almost too late. If this story made you think of someone you love, or if it reminded you of a drawer in your own life that's still waiting to be opened, don't leave it shut. And if you found something meaningful here today, please hit subscribe and share this with someone who might need to hear it. Because some stories don't just deserve to be told, they deserve to be passed on